Never ignore the quietest voice in the room, because it may be the only one telling the truth. The words had barely settled into the silence before the private dining room filled once again with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the distant melody of a grand piano. Nobody turned toward the woman who whispered them. Nobody expected wisdom to arrive wearing the uniform of a black waitress. High above Manhattan, inside one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a confidential business dinner was approaching its final moment. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected thousands of glowing lights while a polished mahogany table held neatly organized contracts, financial reports, and signature folders waiting for a single decision. Benjamin Carter, a respected white billionaire chief executive officer known for closing impossible deals, adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit as his legal counsel slid the acquisition agreement across the table. Months of negotiations, hundreds of conference calls, and countless hours of financial analysis had led to this evening. In only a few moments, Benjamin intended to acquire a rapidly growing technology company in a transaction valued at $700 million. Around him, investment bankers exchanged confident smiles. Corporate attorneys quietly reviewed the final checklist. Senior executives relaxed for the first time all evening, believing every important question had already been answered. Across the room, Naomi Harris moved gracefully between the tables carrying a silver coffee service. Her black waitress uniform blended naturally into the elegant surroundings, making her almost invisible to the influential guests. She served each executive with calm professionalism, never interrupting conversations, never drawing attention to herself. Years of working in luxury restaurants had taught her that excellent service often meant becoming part of the background. As she carefully refilled a coffee cup beside the chief financial officer, her eyes briefly crossed the large financial summary displayed on a presentation screen. She immediately looked away, but one number remained fixed inside her mind. Something about it refused to fit. Continuing toward the next guest, Naomi quietly replayed the projected valuation in her thoughts. Revenue growth, operating margins, long-term expansion, capital investment. Every figure appeared polished and convincing, yet one assumption created a subtle contradiction that connected everything else. She slowed for only a heartbeat before placing another coffee cup onto the table. The formulas themselves might be accurate, but the business story they described suddenly felt incomplete. Benjamin accepted an elegant fountain pen from his attorney and smiled confidently. Outside the private room, reporters waited for confirmation that another landmark acquisition had been completed. Inside, every executive believed history was only one signature away. Naomi looked once more toward the presentation screen. The same inconsistency remained. She understood that saying nothing would allow the evening to continue exactly as planned. She also understood that speaking could easily be dismissed, because no one expected financial insight from someone serving coffee. For a brief moment she simply stood in silence, weighing responsibility against certainty. Finally, as Benjamin lowered the pen toward the contract, Naomi stepped beside his executive assistant and spoke so quietly that only he could hear. "That number is wrong." The assistant blinked in confusion before glancing from Naomi to the financial summary displayed across the room. Benjamin noticed the brief exchange and looked toward the waitress with polite curiosity, unaware that one quiet sentence spoken in complete humility was about to stop a $700 million decision before the ink ever reached the paper. Benjamin Carter paused with the fountain pen still hovering above the signature line, more surprised by the interruption than concerned by the words themselves. Around the polished conference table, no one else appeared to notice what Naomi Harris had whispered to the executive assistant. The assistant glanced at her with puzzled curiosity before quietly lowering his eyes to the printed financial summary in his hands. Benjamin watched the brief exchange from the corner of his vision, then offered a polite smile that carried the confidence of a man accustomed to trusting experienced professionals. "Is everything all right?" he asked calmly. The assistant hesitated before answering. "Probably nothing, sir." She mentioned one of the numbers might deserve another look. A few executives exchanged faint smiles. One investment banker leaned back comfortably in his chair. "Our analysts have reviewed this valuation for months," he said with quiet assurance. "Every assumption has been tested repeatedly." Benjamin nodded, prepared to continue with the signing, but the assistant unexpectedly looked down once more at page 26 of the report. Something about Naomi's certainty made him curious enough to compare the projected valuation against the operating forecast displayed on the presentation screen. At first, everything appeared perfectly consistent. Revenue growth matched the executive summary. Cash flow projections aligned with investor expectations. Yet after comparing one operating assumption against the long-term expansion schedule, he noticed a relationship that felt unusually difficult to explain. Unsure whether he had misunderstood the figures, he quietly walked toward the chief financial officer and placed the report beside his laptop. "Would you mind checking this before we finish?" he asked respectfully. The chief financial officer accepted the document with complete confidence, expecting the review to take less than a minute. He opened the original financial model, entered several values, and compared the operational forecast against the valuation assumptions. His expression gradually changed. He restored the original figures and repeated the process from the beginning. The outcome remained identical. A slight crease formed across his forehead. Without saying a word, he opened additional supporting schedules that had not been displayed during the presentation. Across the room, Naomi calmly continued serving coffee exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. She never watched the executives. She never attempted to defend her observation. She simply believed that once someone looked carefully enough, the numbers would speak for themselves. Years earlier she had imagined spending her career inside conference rooms like this one, not walking quietly between them carrying silver coffee pots. Life had taken a different direction after family responsibilities forced her to leave college, yet she had never abandoned her passion for finance. Every evening after work she studied annual reports, rebuilt public valuation models, and challenged herself to understand why successful companies made the decisions they did. Learning had quietly become part of her daily routine, even when nobody knew it existed. The chief financial officer finally lifted his eyes toward Benjamin with unusual seriousness. "Before you sign," he said carefully, "I would like permission to verify one assumption inside the operating model." The relaxed atmosphere inside the private dining room disappeared almost instantly. Attorneys stopped organizing contracts. Analysts reopened their laptops. Benjamin slowly placed the fountain pen back onto the polished table instead of onto the agreement. He looked first toward the financial model, then toward Naomi, who remained quietly arranging empty coffee cups near the service station, completely unaware that one whispered sentence had already begun changing the direction of a $700 million decision. The chief financial officer connected his laptop to the presentation screen without saying another word. The elegant valuation summary disappeared, replaced by detailed financial schedules that only experienced analysts normally examined. The quiet confidence that had filled the private dining room only moments earlier slowly gave way to careful concentration. Benjamin Carter remained seated with the unsigned agreement resting in front of him, his fountain pen now lying beside the contract instead of above it. Around the table, attorneys reopened legal folders while investment bankers unlocked laptops they had already packed away. Nobody questioned why the review had begun. Everyone simply wanted to understand what had caused the sudden hesitation. The chief financial officer enlarged the operating forecast and displayed it beside the long-term revenue model. "Let us rebuild this section from the original source files," he said calmly. Two senior analysts immediately opened archived spreadsheets from the earliest stages of the acquisition. Another specialist independently reconstructed the valuation without referencing the current model. Quiet keyboard clicks replaced the earlier sounds of celebration. Every executive focused entirely on the growing collection of financial data projected across the wall. Benjamin folded his hands together and watched the investigation unfold with remarkable patience. He had spent decades building successful companies, and experience had taught him that important decisions deserved careful verification, especially when unexpected questions appeared at the last possible moment. Across the room, Naomi Harris continued clearing empty coffee cups from the polished table. She never looked toward the presentation screen. She never interrupted the analysts. Her responsibility had ended when someone agreed to examine the assumption. Whether the executives confirmed her concern or dismissed it completely no longer belonged to her. She trusted evidence more than opinion. Several minutes passed before one analyst quietly stopped typing. He compared the revised operating forecast with projected manufacturing capacity, then looked toward another member of the finance team. Without exchanging many words, they both repeated the calculation independently. The result remained unchanged. A third analyst rebuilt the model from the beginning using only verified operational assumptions. Once again, the outcome refused to move. The formulas themselves remained perfectly accurate. The business assumptions supporting them did not. The chief financial officer slowly leaned back from his laptop before turning toward Benjamin. "Please look at this," he said quietly. Benjamin walked to the presentation screen and studied the revised projections with complete attention. As corrected operating assumptions flowed through the valuation model, projected returns declined significantly. Future cash flow adjusted downward. The company's estimated value fell dramatically. One board member removed his glasses and stared silently at the screen. Another executive opened the original negotiation documents to verify the supporting data once more. Every independent review reached the same conclusion. Benjamin remained calm despite the growing seriousness inside the room. "Run it again," he instructed. "Build the model from the beginning without copying any previous calculations." 20 minutes later, the final verification appeared on the screen. The lead analyst slowly exhaled before speaking. The corrected operating assumptions reduced the company's fair acquisition value by nearly $700 million. Silence settled across the room. Nobody celebrated discovering the mistake, because everyone understood what had nearly happened. Benjamin looked slowly from the revised valuation toward Naomi, who quietly placed the last coffee cup onto her silver serving tray with the same composed expression she had carried throughout the evening. At that moment, he realized the most valuable insight in the room had not come from the people everyone expected to provide it. It had come from the one person almost nobody had noticed until a single whispered sentence changed the future of a $700 million decision. The presentation screen remained frozen on the corrected valuation, while an almost unbelievable silence settled over the private dining room. The number everyone had trusted for months no longer represented reality. Benjamin Carter slowly lowered his eyes toward the unsigned acquisition agreement before gently closing the leather folder with one deliberate movement. The quiet sound echoed through the room more powerfully than any speech could have. Every executive understood exactly what it meant. The deal had stopped. The lead attorney carefully gathered the signature documents without saying a word. No one objected. No one suggested moving forward. The evidence displayed across the screen had become impossible to ignore. The chief financial officer cleared his throat before speaking. "We have now verified the operating assumptions for separate times using independent models. Every review reaches the same conclusion." Benjamin looked directly at him. "State it clearly." The chief financial officer nodded. "If this agreement had been signed tonight, our company would have paid approximately $700 million above the business's realistic valuation." Several board members quietly exchanged astonished looks. One investment banker leaned back in his chair, slowly removing his glasses as though trying to process what had nearly happened. Months of negotiations, hundreds of professional reviews, and dozens of financial experts had all accepted the same assumption without recognizing the contradiction hidden beneath it. Benjamin remained remarkably composed despite the enormous implication. Years of leadership had taught him that panic rarely solved difficult problems. Clear thinking did. He turned toward the legal team. "Notify the sellers that we are suspending the signing pending additional financial verification. Tell them we will provide a detailed explanation within 24 hours. The attorney immediately stepped outside the private room to make the confidential call. Around the table, analysts continued reviewing the supporting schedules, hoping someone might discover an alternative explanation that restored the original valuation. None appeared. Every new calculation reinforced the same reality. Across the room, Naomi Harris quietly collected the final dessert plates with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the beginning of the evening. She neither watched the executives nor waited for recognition. Her attention remained on her work. Benjamin observed her for several moments before speaking. "Miss Harris." Naomi stopped and turned politely. "Yes, sir." Benjamin walked toward her carrying the corrected financial report in one hand. His expression no longer reflected curiosity. It reflected respect. "Would you be willing to show us exactly what you saw?" Several executives turned toward Naomi with genuine interest. Earlier that evening they had barely noticed the waitress moving silently around the conference table. Now every experienced financial professional inside the room wanted to understand the observation that had protected the company from an extraordinary mistake. Naomi looked briefly at the report before lifting her eyes toward the presentation screen. "I can try," she answered quietly. It was never about one number by itself. It was about whether all the numbers were telling the same story. The room became completely silent once again. Even the analysts stopped typing. Benjamin slowly placed the report onto the polished table and stepped aside, inviting Naomi toward the presentation screen. At that moment, the balance of the evening quietly changed. The woman everyone had assumed was there only to serve coffee was now being invited to explain corporate strategy to some of the most accomplished business leaders in the country, proving that genuine wisdom never depends upon a job title before revealing its value. Naomi Harris walked toward the presentation screen with steady, unhurried steps, her expression remaining calm despite the attention of every executive in the room. She did not carry herself like someone who had won an argument. She carried herself like someone who simply respected the truth. Benjamin Carter stepped aside without saying another word, allowing her to stand where only moments earlier the company's senior financial analysts had been presenting their conclusions. The large display still showed the corrected valuation model that had stopped a $700 million acquisition. Naomi studied the screen for several quiet seconds before speaking. "The formulas are accurate," she said gently. "The problem is not the mathematics. The problem is that the assumptions are describing two different businesses." Several analysts immediately leaned forward. The chief financial officer reopened the operational forecast, while another analyst displayed the long-term revenue projections beside it. Naomi pointed toward the operating capacity schedule first. "This section assumes a moderate expansion that requires gradual investment in production, staffing, and infrastructure." She then looked toward the revenue forecast. "But this section expects extremely aggressive growth over exactly the same period. Those two assumptions cannot comfortably exist together unless additional operating investment also appears somewhere inside the model." One analyst quickly searched through the supporting schedules, while another recalculated the projected capital expenditures. The inconsistency became even more obvious. Benjamin watched silently as experienced financial professionals continued verifying every observation Naomi described. She never rushed her explanation. She never attempted to impress anyone with technical language. Instead, she spoke with simple business logic that everyone around the table immediately understood. "Numbers should support the story of a business," she continued. "When one part of that story changes, every connected assumption deserves another question. Otherwise, the spreadsheet becomes internally consistent, while the business itself becomes unrealistic." The chief financial officer slowly nodded. "That is exactly what happened here," he admitted. "The formulas performed perfectly because they followed the assumptions they were given. We focused on calculation accuracy instead of business consistency." Benjamin folded his arms thoughtfully while studying the revised projections. "How did you notice it so quickly?" he asked. Naomi smiled modestly. "Because I was not trying to memorize the numbers. I was trying to understand the company they described." Those words settled across the room with unexpected weight. One senior board member quietly closed his laptop. "Most of us reviewed each section individually," he said. "You reviewed whether they belonged together." Naomi answered with quiet humility. "Businesses are connected systems. Financial statements should reflect that connection." Every executive around the table understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They were no longer listening to a waitress explaining a spreadsheet. They were listening to someone who understood how strategy, operations, and finance supported one another in the real world. Benjamin looked around the room and noticed something that had completely changed since the beginning of the evening. Earlier, people had barely acknowledged Naomi as she quietly served coffee. Now every accomplished executive waited patiently for her next sentence. Titles had quietly disappeared. Respect had taken their place. Benjamin finally smiled, not because the company had avoided a costly mistake, but because he realized the evening had revealed a different opportunity altogether. Hidden beneath an ordinary uniform stood an analytical mind that no resume, office title, or first impression could have accurately measured. reminding everyone present that genuine brilliance often arrives without asking for recognition first. No one spoke for several long moments after Naomi Harris finished explaining the inconsistency inside the valuation model. The executives remained focused on the presentation screen, but their attention had shifted completely away from spreadsheets. They were now looking at the woman standing quietly beside them. Benjamin Carter slowly stepped forward with an expression that carried neither pride nor embarrassment. Instead, it reflected sincere curiosity. "May I ask you something?" he said gently. Naomi nodded. "Of course." Benjamin folded his hands before speaking again. "Where did you learn to analyze businesses this way?" The question surprised several executives because it sounded less like an interview and more like genuine admiration. Naomi smiled softly before answering. "I studied corporate finance in college for 2 years." The room became noticeably quieter. "I planned to finish my degree," she continued, "but my mother became seriously ill. Medical bills arrived faster than we could manage, so I left school and accepted the first stable full-time job I could find." She glanced briefly toward the coffee service before continuing with complete honesty. "That happened to be here." Nobody interrupted. Her voice carried no bitterness, only calm acceptance. "I promised myself that leaving school would never mean leaving education. Every night after work I continued studying. I borrowed finance books from the public library, downloaded annual reports, rebuilt valuation models from publicly available information, and followed acquisition announcements because I wanted to understand how successful companies actually think." The chief financial officer looked genuinely impressed. "You taught yourself everything after that?" Naomi smiled modestly. "Not everything. I simply kept asking questions until the numbers started making sense." One senior board member quietly shook his head with admiration. "Most people stop learning when life becomes difficult," he observed. Naomi answered gently. "Sometimes life changes our schedule. It does not have to change our purpose." Benjamin looked toward the Manhattan skyline visible beyond the towering windows before returning his attention to Naomi. Throughout his career he had interviewed graduates from the country's most respected universities, recruited experienced executives from global corporations, and invested billions of dollars into promising companies. Yet one of the clearest strategic minds he had encountered had been carrying coffee through a dining room instead of presenting inside a boardroom. The realization remained with him. "You never mentioned your background tonight," Benjamin said. Naomi quietly smiled. "Because the numbers should convince people, not my story." Those simple words affected everyone around the table. One analyst slowly closed his laptop. Another executive rested his pen beside the financial reports without writing another note. Benjamin recognized something important that extended far beyond the suspended acquisition. Talent often remains invisible because opportunity rarely searches where appearances suggest it should. Looking around the room, he noticed that every executive now viewed Naomi differently, yet she herself had not changed at all. She remained the same thoughtful, disciplined woman who quietly questioned one assumption because it failed to match reality. Only everyone else's perception had changed. Benjamin realized that leadership required more than making profitable decisions. It required building an environment where the strongest ideas could be heard regardless of who presented them. As Naomi returned the presentation remote to the chief financial officer and quietly gathered the empty coffee cups once again, the executives watched with newfound respect, fully understanding that extraordinary ability does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Sometimes it quietly serves coffee while preparing for an opportunity that no one else realizes is already standing in the room. Benjamin Carter remained standing beside the conference table long after the financial discussion had ended. No one seemed interested in reopening the valuation model because the numbers no longer required another explanation. Instead, every executive found themselves thinking about something much larger than the acquisition itself. Benjamin slowly looked around the room before speaking with complete honesty. "Tonight exposed a weakness inside our company," he said calmly. Several executives looked surprised. They expected him to discuss financial controls or investment procedures. Instead, he continued, "We trusted titles more than thoughtful questions." His words settled quietly across the room. No one disagreed. The chief financial officer nodded first. "We reviewed the calculations repeatedly because experienced analysts prepared them. We never stopped to ask whether someone outside the process might notice what we had overlooked. Benjamin walked toward the presentation screen before turning back to the group. That changes today. Every executive listened carefully. Beginning with our next major investment review, every valuation will include an independent challenge session. The person asking the question will not need the highest title in the room. The only requirement will be evidence and sound reasoning. Several board members immediately agreed. One director smiled thoughtfully. Fresh eyes often see what familiar eyes overlook. Benjamin nodded. Exactly. Confidence should never become permission to stop listening. Across the room, Naomi Harris quietly arranged the coffee service, believing the meeting had finally reached its conclusion. She had no expectation of becoming part of another conversation. Benjamin looked toward her and spoke with genuine respect. Miss Harris, thank you for reminding us that leadership begins with humility. Naomi smiled gently before answering. I only hoped someone would verify the numbers. Benjamin replied with quiet sincerity. You gave us much more than corrected numbers. You reminded us how easily assumptions influence judgment. The executives reflected silently on those words. Earlier that evening, most of them had noticed Naomi only when their coffee cups became empty. Now they realized how quickly appearances had shaped their expectations. One senior board member stood and walked toward Naomi. I owe you an apology, he said honestly. When I first saw you, I assumed you belonged only to the restaurant staff. I never imagined you could understand corporate finance better than many experienced professionals. Naomi answered with characteristic humility. Everyone makes quick assumptions sometimes. What matters is being willing to change them. Her response filled the room with quiet reflection. Benjamin smiled because he realized she had just demonstrated another quality that great leaders possess. She corrected mistakes without embarrassing the people who made them. Looking around the conference room once more, Benjamin understood that the evening would become one of the most valuable leadership lessons of his entire career. The company had certainly avoided losing $700 million, but the financial victory would eventually fade into quarterly reports and annual statements. The lesson about character would remain much longer. Great organizations succeed because they encourage honest questions before expensive mistakes become permanent. Great leaders succeed because they understand that wisdom can arrive from unexpected places. As the Manhattan skyline continued shining beyond the tall windows and the final meeting documents were quietly packed away, everyone present left with a new understanding that respect should never be reserved only for impressive titles. Sometimes the most important voice belongs to the person who speaks the fewest words, and sometimes the strongest act of leadership begins with the simple willingness to listen before deciding who deserves to be heard. The private dining room gradually emptied as legal advisors and investment bankers gathered their documents. Yet Benjamin Carter remained beside the panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan. The acquisition had been postponed indefinitely, but his thoughts no longer centered on the transaction itself. Instead, they returned again and again to Naomi Harris, who quietly finished arranging the coffee service with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her attitude had changed after earning the admiration of an entire executive team. She neither celebrated nor sought attention. Benjamin understood that humility like hers could not be taught in a boardroom. It had been shaped by years of quiet perseverance. He walked toward her with calm purpose. Miss Harris, he said warmly, before you leave tonight, I would like to ask you one final question. Naomi looked up politely. Yes, sir. Benjamin placed one of his business cards on the polished conference table between them. It was simple, elegant, and carried only his direct contact information. Have you ever considered returning to complete your finance degree? Naomi glanced at the card before answering honestly. Every day. I simply have not been in a position to make it possible. Benjamin nodded slowly. Then I would like to remove that obstacle. The room became quiet once again as several executives paused before leaving, sensing that another important moment was unfolding. Benjamin continued. Our company sponsors education for exceptional people who demonstrate extraordinary potential. I would like to personally recommend that we fund the remainder of your university education. When you graduate, if you still wish to pursue corporate finance, I would like you to interview for our strategic investment division. Naomi remained silent for several seconds, visibly surprised not by the generosity of the offer but by the trust behind it. She finally smiled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That opportunity means more than I can express. But if I accept, I would want to earn every position through my work, not because of what happened tonight." Benjamin smiled immediately. "That is exactly the answer I hoped you would give." Several board members quietly applauded. One senior executive laughed softly and said, "I believe you have already passed the first interview." Naomi gently shook her head. Tonight only proved that one question happened to be correct. Real success requires proving yourself every day. Benjamin admired her response even more than her financial insight. Great ability often attracted attention. Character earned lasting respect. Looking around the conference room, he realized everyone present had witnessed far more than a suspended acquisition. They had watched opportunity discover someone who never stopped preparing for it, even when nobody else knew she was preparing at all. As the final reports were packed away and the city lights reflected across the glass walls, Benjamin understood that the company's greatest investment would not be measured on any balance sheet. It would be measured by believing in talent before the rest of the world recognized it. Naomi carefully placed the business card inside her notebook rather than her pocket, treating it not as a reward but as a responsibility. Together they walked toward the exit with the remaining executives, leaving behind an unsigned contract that would soon be forgotten and carrying forward something far more valuable. The beginning of a future created because one quiet woman refused to ignore a number that simply did not belong. 6 months later, the same Manhattan skyline stretched beyond another executive conference room, but this evening felt completely different. The polished table once again held financial reports, valuation models, and strategic proposals. The difference was not the documents. The difference was the people sitting around them. Benjamin Carter entered the room beside Naomi Harris, who now wore a simple professional business suit instead of a waitress uniform. Her university classes had resumed with the company's educational sponsorship, and between semesters she had joined the Strategic Investment Division as an analyst in training. She carried herself exactly as she had on the night everything changed. Calm, prepared, humble. The executives stood to welcome her, not because of sympathy or obligation, but because she had earned their respect through consistent effort. Benjamin waited until everyone had taken their seats before beginning the meeting. "Before we discuss today's agenda," he said, "I would like to tell a story." The room became quiet. Half a year ago, many of us sat together inside a private restaurant believing we were minutes away from completing one of the biggest acquisitions in our company's history. Every experienced advisor believed the numbers were correct. Every report had been reviewed. Every checklist had been completed. Then one quiet voice asked us to look again. Benjamin turned toward Naomi with a grateful smile. That question protected our company from losing $700 million. More importantly, it protected us from believing that wisdom always arrives wearing an expensive suit. Several executives nodded, remembering the evening clearly. Benjamin continued, "Since then we have changed our review process. Every major investment now includes independent challenges. Every team member is encouraged to question assumptions with evidence. We have made better decisions because we learned that truth is more important than hierarchy." He looked around the room before speaking one final time. Leadership is not about always being right. It is about creating an environment where the right idea can be heard. The meeting proceeded, and Naomi quietly participated alongside senior analysts, contributing thoughtful observations without seeking attention. Her confidence no longer came from proving herself. It came from preparation and discipline. During a discussion about another potential acquisition, a junior analyst hesitated before raising a concern about one operational assumption. Months earlier he might have remained silent. This time Benjamin smiled and said, "Please continue." The room listened carefully. Naomi smiled quietly because she realized the company's greatest transformation had never been financial. It had become cultural. People no longer feared asking difficult questions. They understood that thoughtful disagreement protected everyone. As the meeting ended, Benjamin walked toward the panoramic windows and looked across the city where countless dreams continued unfolding behind thousands of lights. Some belonged to chief executive officers. Some belonged to students. Some belong to people working ordinary jobs while quietly preparing for extraordinary opportunities. He understood now that potential rarely announces itself. It simply waits for someone willing to notice it. Naomi gathered her notebook and prepared to leave, grateful not because her life had changed overnight, but because years of quiet perseverance had finally met a single moment of courage. The unsigned contract from that remarkable evening had long since disappeared into company archives, but the lesson it created remained alive inside every important decision that followed. Wealth may open doors. Titles may command attention. But integrity, humility, curiosity, and the courage to speak when something does not feel right remain the qualities that build lasting success. Sometimes one whispered sentence changes a business decision. Sometimes it changes a life. And sometimes it quietly reminds the world that the greatest value a person can ever possess will never appear on a balance sheet.